I have finished I apologize being a bit slow in these, but I went through and took notes over the entire second week about your reactions, New Faces on Main Street. There's a lot of valuable lessons. You guys have wonderful information here. So I'm just going to ramble on, so forgive me. I thought about turning this into a handbook, but that would take even longer to type up. McKenna, a lot of good quotes, a lot of good ideas here. And you'd written, diversity brings obligations too. So when you have diversity in your school, obviously you want to help those students. You want to create communication with the students in the school. You want to share the cultures. But I like that because they're obligations. And what are the obligations? Well, obviously to provide services, to communicate, to do research in cultures, and and I even wrote down, you mentioned that even the rules about eating in the cafeteria are not obvious when you're from another culture. Okay. Hope you like my shirt. Kind of goes with my coffee. Anyhow, so you mentioned that about the young lady. It wasn't obvious how the cafeteria works. You have to get in line, get your food. I assume it's like when I was a kid. You know, food fight starts at a certain time. Braden, in your entry, you talked about the issue of, and Brenda also in your reply to him, you talk about math, how it's, you need to, Braden had mentioned having a word wall. And you could have a little word wall, maybe an electronic one that would have word wall and maybe a Spanish or another version with some either visual or some way so kids can understand concepts like dividing and multiplying and stuff like that. Also story, but we know already that math story problems are reading issues, and how to read those and how to break those down. That's very important. The use of Spanish flashcards is a good one. And those could be created with some effort in other less obvious languages. You know, maybe you had somebody speaking Arabic, he didn't know Arabic, but you know, they are Arabic numbers, so you can't say math isn't connected. And some of the people that are Islam or Muslim may actually know Arabic to some extent. Sometimes you get those groups from Africa, they know Arabic and other languages, including tribal ones. Brenda, you talked about theater as education, and I was immediately thinking, I don't know of any immigrant plays. Maybe students could write plays. Think about that. Students could get together and come up with plays about miscommunication or difficult situations. I could see this as a very creative outlet and emotional connection. It's a lot better than just telling a story is having students act out the story. Joe, you had mentioned about people, and I'm just going through everything here. You'd mentioned the anti-immigrant views in the video, and these are, I can find these throughout history. These patterns are not just something for New Faces on Main Street. It existed for the German ancestors that are mentioned in here about, you know, don't let grandma speak German because it's anti-American. They don't like German. They might think she's a Nazi. And that's why German and really Swedish and some other languages were very much suppressed. Back in the 20s, people were so afraid of outside influences, they prohibited or made it very difficult to have newspapers in foreign languages. There used to be a thriving newspaper business in Swedish and German and Polish, etc. And most of that was wiped out because the Postmaster General could insist that you provide a full translation of every newspaper. And if he didn't like something, he could prohibit it being sent through the mail. So America was trying to purify itself and keep out outside elements. At the very moment, it was allowing people in from Italy and everywhere. Okay, that was called the Red Scare back in the 20s. You can look it up if you want to know. And in fact, it really impacted immigration law. Tanner, every individual is a minority. That is a great quote. Think about ourselves, our psychological inner self. We are really lonely. We're really in our own skin, and that is unknown to other people, even though we may socialize and stuff. A lot of things are still hidden. I work with people every day. I don't know what's going on with them sometimes. They don't share things. Same thing, members of your family, other people. People are very, very stingy about giving out parts of themselves. They want to keep it to themselves for whatever reason. And that's a great quote, because it's not just immigration and refugees and people that are foreigners, but it's much more than that. So that's a very insightful thing. Now, he mentioned having he had a guy from India, a robotics instructor or teacher, talk about robotics, and you explored culture. And this got me into something that's in the rest of this. What do you do when you have cultures in the school that don't communicate? Like I mentioned, Stephanie mentioned that the school had a Black and a Latino, African American and a Latinos, and they're kind of separate cultures in the school. What do you do in those situations? What do you do in situations where it's very homogenous and it seems like there's no diversity at all in the community, or you know what I mean, very little? And that could be all Latino, or it could be all African American, it could be all white, whatever you want to call it. What do you do in those situations? This is a big thing to address here in this class. Guest speakers is a good one. Theater, as I mentioned with Brenda about theater and acting. Getting people to talk to each other, sharing food or clothing or slang with what you can share. Obviously, some of it might be off color. But how can people share these things? And what about sexual orientation issues? Obviously, that's there in the schools. Some people pretend it's not there. And they will, depending on where you're at, they may say, oh, we're not going to talk about that. And the school board or the superintendent or the principal can effectively shut down a lot of discussion. So you have to always try to appeal to state standards and what you feel is decent. So, but how do you get a dialogue going among people that are different in whatever way? And that's a good question. I can sit here and speculate. It might take quite a bit of time, but I would think either there are games or there are activities or there are stories or there are novels. Literature is a great way to share things. Obviously, very young children, you're more into material, objective culture. You don't get into, why is their religion like that if they're Seventh-day Adventist or if they're Jehovah's Witness or if they're Catholic or they, religion can get to be a sticky wicket there. So that's really something I want, to think about. You have a lot of solutions here. I did take some notes. Chelsea was very brave. You said, well, I used to think that they got to assimilate. They got to be like us. Now I know that's not right. Well, thank you for that. I think we all go through that. I know I did. I didn't grow up being Mr. Multicultural or cross-cultural. I used to think wherever you grew up, you thought that was the center of the world and things should be around that, should be like that. Whatever religion you are, if you grew up on a farm, then why are people? I used to be suspicious of people that didn't drive John Deere. That's real paranoid. Why, he has an Allis Chalmers over there. And those Internationals, I don't like those other tractors. They're red like communists. This is back in the 60s. And so I literally thought Allis Chalmers wasn't a real tractor, those orange ones. It was too squatty and little. Our neighbors didn't have big ones. Or Ford, I said, that's a car. Why do they make a tractor? But you can get weird ideas. I was a weird person. So anyhow, next page. I may pull up I print all these off and go through them and take notes. a great quote from Brenda. It is wrong, I paraphrased it. It is wrong to interrupt, disrupt, destroy, put down the cultural and linguistic traditions of your students, whatever they are. They need to continue. The student that Kylie has Vietnamese, her husband's Vietnamese, and others that have like a Guatemalan or Hispanic nephew and stuff. You maintain language, you maintain culture. This stabilizes the family. This is why it provides the glue that keeps grandma and grandchildren communicating. There's nothing worse than saying, and like in the case of the grandmother from Germany and Austria, saying, "Oh, we're not going to speak German anymore. You better give that up." Imagine how horrible that. What kind of a hell would that be? Everything you know, and you're older, and somehow you're supposed to learn a second language. You don't even have values in that second language. You don't know what the words mean. It destroys families. It's that evil. This whole idea of people telling you not to speak English in a grocery or Spanish in a grocery store. No, you should have been angry. I forget who said that, but that really stuck me. I've seen that. I just want to slap people like that. Maybe I will, you know? Okay, what is language? This is very philosophical. Language is everything. It is culture incarnate. Language is your consciousness. Take away words, and what have you got? A person who gets older and can't use language anymore, or has trouble or dementia or whatever you want to call it. And I fear this because it's in my family. And imagine if you couldn't call things, you couldn't remember things. You're just isolated. Psychologically, you're going to be angry, you're going to be upset. And to take that away from a healthy, normal person, it's in their youth, is wrong. It's a terrible sin. I noticed, Joe, you got kicked, you weren't allowed in a certain, or at least some of you, I think it might have been Joe, about Gaijin, foreigner in Japanese, that they wouldn't let you in a certain club because you were an outsider, you were a foreigner. You can imagine how you feel just being blocked, saying because of who you are, you're not allowed in with your friends. That's such a good teacher of what it feels like and what happened with racism in the United States of all kinds, toward Native Americans, toward African Americans, toward Greeks. Italians weren't allowed in certain things. Catholics weren't allowed to be hired in certain jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm not talking about religious jobs. I'm talking about work. They were discriminated. Irish, same way. Language is everything. Without language, you can't think. You just react to visuals. You can drink and you can eat and you can point. That's about it. And that puts you down to the level of some previous evolution of a human before they had language or something. Stephanie, I really am a big promoter of literature. You mentioned that. I think that literature and reading make us civilized, and that's why I want reading to be taught in a way to make people love reading. So any program that makes you hate reading is inherently evil and wrong. And you can quote me on that, and I'll be glad to send the email. But you can share cultures. You can share conflicts between cultures. Kids love to read stuff about their own culture and about real human, genuine conflict. I remember I had a guy that wouldn't read in Lex many years ago, and there was a book called Don't Spit on My Corner. It's technically about gangs in Los Angeles in the 40s. And if you didn't know, a lot of bad things happened to Hispanics in Los Angeles. During World War II, American soldiers coming back from the war, going to the war, would actually have taxi cab drivers. They'd have them drive them around, and they would jump out and attack Hispanics for sport. And if they wore zoot suits, they'd really go after them. So this country is horribly, we're fighting a war against Nazism and fascism, and then we're busy beating up on minorities in our own country. That's called irony. All right, here's another one. And if you want to know about that, just look up Zoot Suit Riots, Z-O-O-T, which you can also use in Scrabble. That's a good score. I've been playing a lot of Scrabble lately. Okay, Shane, you mentioned in your family trading tamales for cookies. Boy, that's family. Tamales for cookies. And you know, tamale making in the Hispanic family is not just cooking, it's an activity. It's a whole family activity. And bilingualism is a strength. I just want to throw that in. I don't know, I had that down. Haley, you have a very diverse situation. You have Karen. I call them Karen, but maybe I'm wrong. Southeast Asian refugees from Myanmar, I think, or Thailand, or on the border. You have Hispanics, you have Africans and African Americans, which has got to be interesting when you have people that may look similar but are totally different cultures. It's got to be interesting. What to do in a non-diverse school? Okay, I wrote that down. I've already addressed that, so I won't go back to it. Alex, on page 23, or I'll just mention a little bit here. Some of these are worth quoting, but I won't read them out. If we were in class, I'd make you read it out. But Alex, you talk about the Hmong, about your German great-grandmother born in Austria, taken over by the Nazis, and she finally immigrated to the United States, and she was pressured to lose her cultural identity. You also talk about you are a math teacher in Gish and Grand Island High School, and you try to help all your students succeed. And you have some really good strategies, having students of two language groups set together, can kind of work together on math. Use the resources of your students. I believe it's important to allow students to speak their native language, promote their cultural ideas, diversify the conversation and ideas are being shared. Pairing up in groups. That was, so if you would look at Alex's entry there, very good. It's got some strategies. That's why I kind of highlighted it. Kelly, you talked about the Gallup strength of schools, and I want to mention, this was mentioned by a couple of you, the Gallup, I guess, organization does polls. They also, they have, it's a book called Teach with Your Strengths, and it helps you identify what are you good at. And you had on here harmony, developing relationships, empathy, and restorative, which I assume is helping people build back up, and communication, influencing. So, and I like this approach because rather than the negative approach, we start out saying, what are your skills? Not everybody has the same skill. This thing could be applied, although it's cultural. You realize this is cultural to Americans, but something like this could be used in some way to work with students and what their skills are. The best thing you can do is encourage some of your students that want to become teachers, because they already start out with the ESL background, which means they're really going to be good because they know what's going on. Plus they speak the language. And I also encourage you to learn Spanish or whatever language, even Somali, learn something about it. I tried to go online and learn Somali or some of the languages more difficult. And Arabic wasn't impossible, but I couldn't understand any of the sounds at all. And so I would need intense exposure to certain languages because the sounds are not any sound I make. And so they're totally new. One of the rules about speaking a language is you have to hear the sound before you can make it. So if you don't really hear it, just like when I hear something in Chinese, I can't quite make that, like the president of China, XI, Xi, I think it's that. But if I don't, it's not XI like Malcolm X. Hi, President XI. That doesn't work. This birthday party was an interesting thing, Kelly. You've experienced what it's like to go into a social group and you're the outsider. After a while, you feel kind of weird because everything's going on, you're just outside. So, but your kids play, and that's the beginning. See, beginning's always rough. Okay, just like you go on your first date, everybody's stressed out. They don't know what to think. I don't know, this year, Haley, you have Karen, somebody from Tanzania. Used to be called Tanganyika in Zanzibar. Got together and called it Tanzania. I remember that from the 60s when those little tiny island in Tanganyika. I can't really say it, but I remember I couldn't say it. And then you have some people in South America. And you've been very successful getting them to work together. Yeah, and working in the ESL teacher, working with them in small settings so she can get a lot of details and really get to know them. The relationships make the difference. And I like this Zaida Falcone, when you make the response about people still say these people and they, and that's always that was way back in civil rights when people used to talk about African Americans. They'd say you people or these people, and that's a distance that puts them off. If I were talking about you and I was saying related to your family, and I talked to you and I said, you people need to get your act together, you'd be very insulted. And then the grocery store, when Zaida, I'm sorry if I said it wrong. You can, Seta? Okay. When you were told, speak English, you're in America. I know, I just mentioned at the start because that really stuck me. I just want to punch people like that. I heard somebody one time go up and say, you need to speak Mexican. You got to quit speaking Mexican. I said, Mexican? Technically, Mexican is a native language from a long time ago. That's why the country got its name. Okay, I'm glad your mother probably quieted you down. And Joe, I really liked yours about not being allowed in whatever the tavern was. Oh, I'm sorry, you're not a member because you're not from the right place. Alyssa, I had more stuff here. There it is. It's all on the back here. Let me catch up on everything. It's important to translate, Alyssa. You mentioned that, and I wrote, translate everything you can. And get people that can speak the language. Don't have people translate who are not very articulate in their own Spanish. A lot of people speak Spanish but can't write, and it's embarrassing. I know somebody did that once, or somebody translated, and it was hilarious. The parents got this message from the school, and it made them think that beer was going to be served for drinks. Maybe it was the word bebidas. I don't remember, but it was like they weren't sure. They said, oh, well, they can have beer at school? Well, that's going to have a lot more interesting conferences. I did want to mention about Joe. You mentioned this about Gaijin and Japanese. That's a whole historical thing, resistance to the outsiders. And Japan was very successful. It was never no colonial power came over and took over Japan. They did most of the rest of Asia, but the Japanese were very hardcore resisting invasion and did not permit, even the Spanish 400 years ago, they were allowed to trade with Japan, but they called it the Black Ship or the Black Fleet, and it would go from Philippines up to Japan, and they would trade, and then they would come back to Spain eventually, I guess. And they were the only ones allowed in. It was very strict. So Japan has always been careful to control the cultural spigot. They didn't let people in, and it's still that way. It's a mindset of resistance to outside change. we see it in our own way here, but it's different because we got here and thought we were born here, you know. Michelle, you talk about criticism about China. You're teaching Chinese students, and people are questioning, why are you doing that? What are you teaching them? And what are they up to over there? You know, paranoid, you know where that's coming from. It's always been in American culture, but it's getting it's being, I would say, trumpeted around. Okay. I was thinking today, what if I taught with Twitter? I just sent you little Twitter messages all the time. Oh, I love it. We don't even need books anymore. You can get teach a whole class in 200, what is it now, 260 characters? Okay. Jorge, I like the global citizen comments. Very, very strong. And your whole entry, when you had a large entry, I forget what page that was in, near the end, when you talked about why people immigrate to the United States: fear, personal safety, economic survival, existence survival, jobs, family, whatever. But those are important to know. And people that don't understand that lack empathy. They said, well, why would you want to go there? I said, I want my kids to have a chance to live normal lives and to not be afraid and to not be poor and to not starve to death. And when people don't understand that, then you know there's a huge disconnect. Now, one thing I was really amazed. Well, I want to get this first. Natalie, you talked about poverty. Poverty is an interesting variation in here. And then, Jorge, you talked about poverty. And there's poverty of culture and knowledge, and there's poverty of lack of material things that you need to survive, or even luxury things, if you know. But poverty is interesting. The lady that teaches about poverty, I've got the book here. I'm going to look, but I don't think I have it where I can just pick it up. Ruby Payne, that's it. Ruby Payne teaches about poverty, and I question her quite a bit. And so no one mentioned that name, but she teaches poverty in a way that I think is very not good. It kind of is, I would say, almost demeaning, that if you're poor, there's something in there about poor people knowing how to get you bailed out of jail or something like that. As if rich people don't go to jail, which of course they don't go to jail as much. But the point is that if you attach certain situations to it, I'm poor, then it means if you're poor, then you not only lack certain things, but you're almost criminal. And that's something you got to watch, because that's why we get this school to jail or prison situation, if some of you have heard, where kids are almost criminalized in school. A lot of questions about that use of security officers. I just read today a guy arrested 2 6-year-olds and was taking them in to be booked, and he got suspended for that, because you don't arrest 6-year-olds for throwing a tantrum and take them to jail. That tells you something about who they're hiring for their security officers. They're not professionals. Okay, the last thing, a couple of last things. I know I'm talking too long. This whole thing about El Silbón, the legend of the Whistler, I looked that up. And Michelle, you teaching about that, and it's a great story. El Silbón is a legend, and you can look it up, Silbon with accent on the O, but you won't need the accent. And it's basically a horror story of a giant guy that has the bones of his own father in a bag that he carries around. And you hear the whistle in the distance, that means he's very close to you. And it's kind of like the legend of La Llorona, the woman that drowned her children, and you hear her screaming in the night, and children are out running around. She'll grab them and do them in. It's kind of like, and I was thinking of other things like Pumpkinhead, or the thing under your bed, the boogeyman. And this spooky story. I mean, what? He killed his father, kept his father's bones in a bag, and he's condemned to, and he goes around, if he finds drunks, he somehow gets all the alcohol out of their stomach and then kills them. Or womanizers, men are chasing women, can be killed. Or just innocent people who are just out running around. He comes over the roof and grabs you, and he's a monster. And so, gosh, it's kind of creepy even hearing about it. So those are really good things in October to talk about, if you're allowed to in your school, about legends of scary things. I remember reading these, and I got a book here called Ghost Stories of the Southwest, and it's about Hispanic ghost stories. And some of them are creepy. You know, some of them are like, I remember there's one about little vampire children that live, you see them by the side of the road in the dark, like they're waiting for a bus, but you drive by and they're just off in the side and you see their eyes glowing, and they'll suck the blood out of you or something, or, you know, all kinds of monsters. Like, what's that one, Jeepers Creepers, that thing would fly out of the cornfield. That stuff is creepy. So I like to ghost hunt, so I like getting scared. Finally, Kylie, you mentioned Vietnamese in your family, and you went to Belize near Guatemala. I wonder if you had any pictures of that, because that would be beautiful to see, because you'd basically have the topography of Guatemala. And I know, Rachel, you mentioned working at Head Start, and Kayla, you mentioned going from GI to Ravenna, and what a change it was. And that's why I was thinking about how to teach multiculturally in a smaller school. Okay, this was wonderful. I'm sorry I was a little slow, but I had to talk about this stuff because it's so good. It's great reading material. That's why I recommend, if I could, I'd make this the textbook, because you provide your own stuff. Thank you, and I will be quiet now. And I'm going to work on some more stuff, and I'll send you another video.